Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Joining me on this episode of Writers at Work is writer, producer, and showrunner John Wirth. John's current project is Dark Winds, the series on AMC that draws its inspiration from the novels of Tony Hillerman. Its third season kicks off on March 9th and has already been renewed for a fourth season. John's been involved in well-written and well-crafted TV for quite a while. He broke into the business in the 1980s as a writer for the detective series Remington Steele, then wrote for and was an executive producer for NASH Bridges. Other writing and producing credits include contributions to The Ghost Whisperer, PICKET FENCES, Terminator, the SARAH Connor Chronicles, and V. John was on the staff of Hell on Wheels, the AMC series pegged to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s, and was named its showrunner for the final 3 seasons. As for Dark Winds, John became showrunner in its second season. He continues to write for the series, co-contributing 2 scripts in season 2 and 2 more this season. I've watched the new season and found it fascinating. I'm eager to talk to John about his career in general, but also about Dark Winds. John Wirth, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you. Good to be here.
John, your start in the screenwriting business is stuff of Cinderella-like legend. Would you mind recounting for us how you broke in?
Which time?
Well, I'm thinking of that school teacher up there in Minnesota.
Yeah,
Who suddenly decides to go for it.
I see. Okay. Yeah, so I had a master's degree in English and Spanish and was teaching junior high school, which was what we called middle school now. And I was making $11,000 a year. This is going back in the 70s, Jim.
Yep.
And living in a house with 4 guys who were eating my food out of the fridge. You know how that goes, what young guys do. And I had always wanted to be a writer. So I thought, well, okay, I'm 25. If I'm going to make a move, I got to make a move now. And, you know, back then things were so different than they are now. I mean, there was no internet. You could barely get your hands on a script. I didn't even know that writers wrote television episodes, like a lot of people. I thought, well, the actors are just making it up, So anyway, I wrote a spec script. I had grown up in the Los Angeles area and but was living in the Midwest at that time. And so I came back and decided to try to become a movie writer. But I didn't know anything about anything. I had written 1 script. That's it. It was terrible. It was sort of an Animal House thing. And Animal House came out shortly after I arrived here. And I thought, how did they stole my movie? How did they steal my movie? And so I finally met this guy quite by coincidence. I was telling my writer's room this story yesterday, actually. In those days, we used to have to go to Kinko's or someplace to print your scripts because everything was hard copy and you had to deliver them, yourself. And so I was in this Kinko's, and I met a guy there, and he asked me, he saw my script and he said, "Did you write that?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you a movie writer?" And I said, "Well, yeah, sort of." He said, "Have you had anything made?" I said, "No." He said, "Have you sold anything?" I said, "No." He said, "Have you ever considered writing for television?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, do you want to be in a business where everything you write gets made, or do you want to be in a business where nothing you write gets made?" I said, "I want the first." And he said, "Well, I work for a show called 8 is Enough, story editor there. Why don't you come in and pitch?" I had no idea what he was talking about. So made a meeting, went in there to pitch. I had several conversations with him prior to going in there because I had no idea what any of this meant, you know?
Right.
So I
Right.
went in there with some story ideas. I pitched and I sold one. And to make a long story short, um, um, well, it's too late for that. I realize, Jim, but um, anyway, I won't tell you the part about going to lunch with Betty Buckley, who was a star of that show. Um, but I sold a story, and then I got paid to write the story, and they cut me off at the story, and they wrote the script in house, which is not an unusual circumstance. I know now, but then I thought, I had done something wrong or failed, or I didn't know what was going on. But then it took me almost 5 years to get a job. And in that period of time, I wrote 25 spec scripts and just scuttled around trying to meet people. There was no sort of infrastructure then where I don't even think most television shows had writers' rooms. Um, you couldn't work as a writer's assistant or a script coordinator or a PA in a writer's room and work your way into a writing job like a lot of people do and have done over the last 20 or 30 years. So it was all about just writing scripts and trying to meet somebody who could get your script to somebody or who was somebody that could read your script.
Right.
Right.
Was there,
So go ahead.
no, no, I'm thinking about those 25 spec scripts.
Yeah.
Was there one in particular that you can recall where you thought to yourself, you know what? I just might have the stuff to do this right?
Well, it was a lot of trial by error. I was continuing to watch movies, um, not only movies that were coming out at the time, but trying to get my hands on uh, copies of movies, VHS copies and stuff, which was what we had back then.
Right.
Um, and I was aware, I mean, I was very determined to do this. And like a lot of writers who watch television and movies, I had the sense that I could do it better than I was actually seeing it done
Right.
in the world, which may or may not have been true, but it was a thought that sustained me. And and so I knew each one was getting better, but I was getting nowhere. And so finally, I decided, I'm going to be 30 in a year. I'm tired of being poor. I, you know, I had a higher standard of living as a school teacher, which was sad. Um, and so I thought I'm going to write 3 scripts and then I'm going to take a shot with these 3 scripts. And if I don't get anywhere, then I'm going to cut out and go have a life. I'm not going to live the next 50 years scrambling around LA trying to be in show business. So I wrote a spec, Remington Steel. I wrote a spec, Family Ties, and I wrote a spec feature. And I had an agent at the time who was nobody had ever heard of. His name was Bill Block. And he went on to become a very successful producer of movies, did quite well for himself. But at the time, he was scrambling around trying to be a legitimate agent. And so I'd given him these 3 scripts. And I also had met a few people by that time. So I knew a guy who had worked on the Paramount lot as a comedy writer. And he got the Family Ties to a writer producer named Lloyd Garver, who was on Family Ties. And he was the first ping that I got on those 3 scripts. He called me up and he said, I read your script. I loved it. It's really funny. We could never do it. It's too outrageous. It was about a person. Do you remember that show at all, Jim?
I do. Yes, I do.
So my story was a guy comes back to see this couple, the Family Ties parents, and had been a friend in college and had had sex with the wife in college before they were married and kind of blew up their friendship, the 3 of their friendship. And
Uh-huh.
the husband and wife made up and got married and had this family. And so now this person was coming back to visit them, but had had a sex change operation.
Oh my.
And was determined to have sex with the husband just to complete the,
Oh gosh.
the picture. And so he said, we could never do that story, but I loved your writing. And when we just went on hiatus, when we come back, I want to bring you in to pitch. And I was super excited. I thought, okay, I'm going to do something here. And then this friend of mine named Gary Randall, who has been a producer and an executive over the years, he knew a young executive who was working at MTM at the time named John Scheinfeld. And he called me up one day and he said, what are you doing tonight? And I said, I don't know. You tell me, what am I doing? He said, you're coming to the Dodger game with me and bring your Remington Steele script. So I said, all right. So I went to the game and he was there with John Scheinfeld, this young executive from MTM. So we talked, got to know each other. Scheinfeld is still a very good friend of mine today, by the way. So is Gary. So I gave him the script. And a couple days later, John Scheinfeld called me and he said, hey, I read your script. I really like it. I know some things that are going on that TV show that would affect the content of your script. Would you be willing to do a rewrite based on my notes? And I said, sure. So I did. And he sent the script in to Michael Gleason, who created the show and was the executive producer of that show. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call. Could I come in and meet with Michael? So two things. I was super excited and a nervous wreck. And I remember driving over Laurel Canyon to go to MTM, which is CBS Radford Studios now, and went in to have a meeting with him. And I walked in and the only thing on his desk was the cleanest desk I'd ever seen anywhere. And it remained so for the 4 years that I worked with him. And the only thing on the desk was my script. And so I sat down and he said, I love your script. I want to buy it and we're going to make it. So I didn't know that was something that almost never happened. So I said, okay. So he said, I've got some notes. I'm going to give you some notes, go off and do the revisions, send the script in and great job. So I did, sent the script in and heard nothing for 3 weeks.
Oh, it must have seemed like forever.
Yeah. And I thought, okay, well, here we go. I had my shot and I blew it. Then I get a call. Can you come in for a meeting with Michael Gleason? So I go in, I sit down at his desk and he says, so what are you up to? And then the bullshit started kicking in. I said, well, I got a thing at Paramount and I got I'm working on this miniseries for, Universal and blah, blah, blah. He looked at me. He was so kind, but so knowing. And he said, you got nothing going on, right? I said, yeah, no, I don't. Not really. And he said, how would you like to work here? I said, what? And so he hired me as a staff writer on that show. And I have worked every day I've wanted to work since that day, which was a March day in 1984.
My goodness. So, John, when I look at your bio, there are some dead spots because you're working on things that are not being produced at the moment. You're working, and I've always found it fascinating that you got to keep up your chops and manage your career simultaneously.
Yeah.
Have you enjoyed that, or has that always been too challenging? Or I mean, do your chops suffer when we're focusing on business? Does the business suffer when you're deep into a script? How do you juggle all of that?
It's kind of one and the same, really. I mean, those dead spots, I was working and producing a lot. I mean, there was a time when these companies were making overall deals with writers. And so I had, maybe I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10 years where I was in overall deals at studios, not working on series, just developing pilots and shows for them. And I made a few pilots. I wrote many more pilots that then got made. But I was always under contract at a studio, even though I wasn't working on a TV show. And it was great for me at the time because we had started our family, we had 2 kids, and I was able to kind of be more in control of my hours than you are when you're working on a television series. And so I did that for quite a while. I think I wrote probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 pilots. As I said, several got made. One got ordered to series, but then canceled before we even got going. And that was very frustrating, but the schedule was working out for me and it was very lucrative. So at a certain point, I just decided I've had it with this, I'm getting nowhere fast and I'm going to go back on a TV show. So I went back on the first show I went on after these many years in development was The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr., which was, a sort of wonderful, quirky sci-fi Western that Carlton Cuse was running. And that's where I met him. We became fast friends. And I just had dinner with him Saturday night. We did 6.5 seasons of NASH Bridges together. And so once I went back into the series business, that's when, the credits started to stack up, although I have stayed on shows for a long time in the days when shows ran for a long time.
I'd like to talk about Hell on Wheels
Yeah,
because I loved Hell on Wheels, so that's a pretty selfish from my point of view. But
I did
uh,
too.
you became a showrunner in the third season. Um, could you explain to us what a showrunner is?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest explanation is the person who runs the show. Um, and I believe this nomenclature got invented by the New York Times with regard to John Wells when he was doing ER.
Hmm.
Spielberg and Michael Crichton were executive producers on the show. John rewrote Michael Crichton's feature script into a television pilot. The show got picked up, and John was the executive producer, head writer running the show. But Spielberg and Crichton, had these had the bigger names, and so there was some confusion as to well, who's in charge of the show, and I think this may be an apocryphal story. I don't think it is. I think the New York Times assigned the name of showrunner to John Wells to designate that he was the guy who was actually on the show day to day, running the show. And so that I believe that title just got memorialized into our most recent WGA contract with the studio.
Really? Ah, okay.
So like on my show now, there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other executive producers. No, wait, 6, 8 other executive producers. So, unless I had the title showrunner, you might wonder which one of those 8 people is actually running
Right.
the show.
I just thought of it as the capo tutti capi, but yeah, I was wondering, this might be an oddball question, but do you think your experience as a teacher has helped you in the writer's room?
Yeah, it has. I mean, my nickname for many years was Teacher Man.
Ah,
And I always embrace that because I've really worked hard to teach people how to write, how to write a story for a TV show. Once I figured it out, which took a long time. I'm a slow learner. It's when we were doing NASH Bridges, I came up with this idea to do a television writer's handbook for the Writers Guild. And because nobody had ever quantified what it was to be a television writer and what the various ranks of a television staff were, and how you are supposed to be, how you are expected to behave in those various jobs, from freelance writer, as we had in those days, all the way up to executive producer, showrunner. And so I convened a committee at the Writers Guild that included a bunch of showrunners, people who were running shows that I knew, including Jeff Melvoin. And we did this booklet, which I thought would take a couple of months, and it ended up taking 5 years. So people had, created shows, got them on, had them run for 100 episodes, and had them canceled. Got married, had babies, gotten divorced, all during the time it took to write this little, 50-page pamphlet that we did for the Writers Guild. But that became a very meaningful document that was distributed to all writers in the Guild. And then Melvoin, along with Carol Kirshner, who is an executive and has worked at the Guild, they decided they wanted to try to put together a showrunner training program, which I was pretty involved in the beginning, but I felt like, okay, I'm just too busy. I put my 5 years in on this already, and I'm kind of done doing it. So Melvoin kept going with it, and it's become an incredibly successful, meaningful program under his tutelage in the last 10 or 15 years. So yeah, I think teaching is very important, and probably something we don't have the time to talk about here, Jim, but
No, I understand.
It's not sorry. The
No,
business is not conducive at all to young writers learning how to be junior writers, mid-level writers, producer writers, and showrunners, because it's just not the way the business works anymore.
I do want to I want to spend time with Dark Winds, because I've had the pleasure of seeing the third season. But I want to ask one more question about Hell on Wheels.
Yeah.
Because I'm beginning to get a sense of how you conduct yourself. I understand that the producers weren't necessarily wanting you to become the showrunner for the third season, but my memory is that the third, fourth, and fifth seasons of Hell on Wheels really took off for me as a viewer. So I'm getting. What did you do with that initial resistance? How did you turn that into such a positive?
Well, I do have a bit of a reputation as a fixer. I've gone to work on a number of shows, including this one, that needed fixing, and I fixed them. And I don't know why I have that ability. I don't think everybody does. Some people create shows and they have careers that way. And I have created one show in all the years I've been doing this. So I never really kind of my career didn't go the way I had imagined it might in the beginning, but I became a guy that could come into a show that was problematic or had trouble of some kind and straighten it out and fix it. And so the Hell on Wheels had that show had been on for 2 seasons, and it was created by the Gayton brothers, and they had not been television guys, and so AMC, who made the show, assigned a showrunner to work with them. And I guess there were conflicts between those 3 people. And so I wasn't here. I don't really know the story, but if I'm guessing, I would guess that AMC decided that one or all of those 3 people had to go. And I think they made a decision that the brothers would be removed from the show. And then the guy who had been the showrunner, they were going to anoint him as the showrunner. And so they announced the pickup of the series they announced that this guy would be running the show, and that was the first he'd heard of it. And he'd already decided, I'm not doing that. So he called them to say he wasn't doing it, and then they were scrambling for who was going to take over as the showrunner. And so I have a funny story, which I'll tell you. It's a good Hollywood story about how I got on that show. So my wife and I were, I'd been working, I don't remember what I was doing, but we decided we were going to take a vacation for a month or so and go to Italy. And we were pretty deep into planning this trip. And my agent called and said, hey, what do you know about Hell on Wheels? I said, nothing. What is it? He said, it's a TV show. I said, well, I know it's a TV show, but is it the thing about motorcycles? And he goes, no, it's a Western. I said, oh, okay. No, I haven't seen it. He said, well, they're looking for a showrunner. I got you a meeting. And I said, but I don't want a meeting because I'm going on vacation. He said, I got you a meeting. You're going to the meeting. He said, I'm going to Italy with my wife. I don't want to go to a meeting because what if I got the job? He said, dude, you don't have the job. You just have an appointment to go to a meeting. If you get the job, you can turn it down and go to Italy, but you're going to the meeting. My agent is Paul Haas. He's represented me for 35 years. So we have this kind of relationship, which is amusing to me. So I go to the meeting, and there's 3 people in the meeting. And so I come in and I sit down, and they said, so what do you think of the show? And I had not seen it.
Oh my.
So I said, well, I'll be honest with you guys. I haven't seen it. I'm not looking to work. My wife and I are going on vacation, trying to go to Italy. We're pretty deep into planning it. But, you know, I've been involved in the showrunner training program. I know a lot of people. And if you're looking for a showrunner, if you tell me what exactly it is you're looking for, I might be able to, you know, help you find the right person. And one of the people got, you know, very offended by that and said, that's our job. Thank you. We can do that. And what the hell are you doing here if you haven't seen the show and you're not interested in the job? I said, well, I'm here because my agent said he had made the meeting and I had to go to the meeting. And so they kind of sat there kind of dumbfounded. And then one of the guys stood up across the table from me, and he reached his hand out to shake my hand, and he said, thanks for coming in. I was like, all right. So I left, and I got in my car in the parking garage, and I wasn't even out of the parking garage, and my cell phone rang, and it was my agent. Can I swear on this podcast?
Yes, you bet. You can.
He said, so I answered the phone. He goes, what the fuck did you say in there? And I said, well, and he said, dude, they want you. I said, what? They want you hard. I said, okay. And I told him, and he couldn't believe it. He said, you better bottle that, you know, because this is the most amazing thing I've ever heard of. So anyway, they hired me for the show. And then, so I had to go home and tell my wife that, you know, I was going to take this job, and they wanted me to watch episodes. And so they sent 20 episodes to my house. This is in the days when they came on DVD. Mm-hmm. And she was like, you've got to be kidding me. We were into planning this trip and everything. And I said, all right, look, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put on the pilot. We're going to watch 5 minutes of it. And then I'm going to call up my agent and say, I'm passing on the show because I don't connect with the content. And you're going to be with me since you're part of this. And, you know, this is just our pact. We're going to do this together. She goes, okay, great. So I put on the pilot, and Anson Mount comes on, and my wife is sitting next to me on the couch, and I'm watching the TV screen, and I hear next to me, oh. I looked at her and said, what? She goes, oh my. What do you mean? Oh my, what? She goes, he's gorgeous. I said, Gail, you're old enough to be his mother. And she said, he doesn't know that. She said, "You're taking this job." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I want to meet him." Like, you've got to be kidding me. Anyway, it turns out that I really love the show. And so I called them up to say I was going to do the job. And they called me in and they said, all right, what's wrong with the show? And I said, I don't know. I don't think there's much wrong with it. I have to think about it. I have to get in a room with writers and talk about it. I said, but what I think I would do is right now it's playing as an ensemble show with a bunch of wonderful characters, but I don't know what to look at. And you have, by the nature of the show, you have Anson Mount's character, Cullen Bohannon, who brings me, the audience, to the railroad. And I'm sort of feeling like I want him to be my point of view character. I want to see the world through him. So, not that the other characters won't be important, they'll all have stories. I'm not going to diminish anybody's role in the show, but I'm just going to put Anson Mount at the center. So we have sort of like the star of the show, and then everybody else reverberating off of him. And that was the concept. That's what I went into the writer's room with. And that seems to have changed everything on that show. And in my mind, it was a fairly small change that nobody else sort of thought of.
But what a wonderful show, though. I don't recall anything like it before, and I do.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, and I really want to get to Dark Winds because I've loved it from the beginning. I think many of our subscribers were and are Tony Hillerman fans.
Yeah.
Season one draws its inspiration from Tony's Listening Woman and People of the Darkness. As a writer and as a showrunner, what kind of latitude do you have and do you give your writers regarding adapting those stories?
Well, I was a fan of the Hillerman books also when I was in my 20s and 30s. I read them, voraciously and couldn't wait for them to come out. I was very intrigued with the whole Navajo aspect of the books. When I came to the show was when I realized that the books are difficult to adapt to a television show because we tell stories differently now because our storytelling has evolved in the 40 or 50 years since these books were written. Also, Hillerman takes an outside-in look kind of at the Navajo Nation. He's a white man writing about Navajo people, so I've tried to flip the script on it and tell the story from the Navajo perspective, which is quite different than telling the story from a white perspective or through a white lens or through an ND lens. And there are a lot of things in 2025 vis-a-vis Navajo culture and religion and cosmology that we really can't put on television and be respectful of the Navajo culture and the Navajo people. So we actually have to do quite a bit of invention on the show. So what I look for in the novels each season is I'm looking for a story that is going to expand the universe. So last year we combined two novels. We did Dance Hall of the Dead and The Sinister Pig. And it's interesting because George R. R. Martin, who's one of our exec producers, he considers Dance Hall the best of the Hillerman books and The Sinister Pig as the worst of the Hillerman books.
Ah,
So we combined those two stories because in the previous season we had the Bernadette story led her to decide to leave the Navajo Nation and go work on the Border Patrol. And The Sinister Pig is a nice, beautiful, juicy story about what happens to her character when she's working on the Border Patrol. And Dance Hall is sort of a murder mystery set on the Zuni Reservation, which is next door to the Navajo Nation. And as it turns out, there was a bunch of very highly religious aspects to that story, which the native writers on the show didn't feel comfortable telling. in a television format. So we had to invent a lot of stuff. And then we combined those two stories. And we have a really, well, you've seen season 3, yes?
Yes, I have.
So turns out we had a, pretty interesting story, and we found a way to kind of dovetail the two stories so they kind of became one as we.
Yeah, they weave together so well.
Yeah.
Look, you know this. Dark Winds works because it's a compelling crime series. We're learning about Native American culture, but something that you've done so wonderfully is the soulfulness of Lee Porn and Chi and Emma Lee Porn, and you just mentioned Bernadette Manolito. These are
Yeah.
really deeply felt characters.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
as a writer, um, how do you work with your writers' room to ensure that that depth of character comes across? I mean, all 4 people I just mentioned, they're not cursory characters. There's nothing cursory about them. How do you make sure that we see and feel that?
Um, I think it's just, I one thing that is, I think, a hallmark of my writing, if I can talk about my own writing,
Please.
um, there's a lot of heart in it, and I am drawn to the maudlin drama. I can be I can be emotional. I'm
Sure.
tapped into that stuff. I got 2 daughters. That has helped. Um, but I'm interested in the character part of the story, and I've learned a lot about, there is a kind of a thing. I did a show at Netflix called Wu Assassins, which was about Chinese American characters, and we had a lot of Asian writers on that show and Asian consultants and virtually all Asian cast. And I had a similar experience there where, I felt that, and to talk about Dark Winds, I feel like there's a fundamental humanity that on some level all people share. We react to the natural world kind of similarly. You look through, world religions and mythologies, and you find the same sorts of, you know, things, aspects of religions, whether they've ever connected or not throughout history, that are similar, like the virgin birth and, you know, many, many, many other similarities. And so I kind of feel like people are people. And
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
Dark Winds, what I really resonated with was, you know, there's a character, Emily Porn, which is the police lieutenant's wife. She's not really germane to the story. The story can go happily on its way without involving her because she's not a cop. She's not going to help investigate the mystery or anything like that. So I started thinking about, how can I get her into the story? And I inherited a happy accident, which was not a part of the novels, as I recall. I'm pretty sure this is true. Um, Graham Rowland had invented a character, a son for Joe and Emily Porn, who had died in an accident, an industrial accident, before the series started. And that was, so in season 2, when I came on, that was a sort of happy accident for me, because I thought, well, that story isn't resolved. There's some dramatic tension between this man and this woman about the death of their son. And so I wanted to explore that, and by way of, and that was my way into exploring their marriage.
Yes.
So I kind of got into putting that marriage on TV, the idea that, people would think, well, they're Navajo people. There's something exotic about them. They're not like regular people. Well, the fact is they are.
Yes.
And so we told that story, and we developed in season 2, Leaphorn gets involved in investigating a murder of a Navajo man, and then he realizes that the murderer had murdered other Navajo people, one of whom was his son. So he ends up investigating the murder of his own son, which drove a wedge in his marriage because his wife had been trying to put this behind her. And it was a very interesting problem, and it brought the whole thing center stage, for it was what was underneath the investigation itself. And when you have those kinds of levels, that's how you can go deeper, to use your phrase from earlier.
Yeah.
Everything just deepens and gets murkier the deeper into the center of the earth you go.
And
And
you
that's what
do,
makes for interesting drama, I think.
yeah, you do for the viewer what we novelists try to do for the reader, which is when the character enters the room, we have a sense of what may happen because we know them on an intuitive level. You've connected us to them beyond a surface level. And again, I don't want to spoil it, but Emma and Joe have some amazing conversations in this third season. And it's because
Yes.
we know them so well.
Yes. And the happy accident continues. I mean, I have to say, I thought I was done with the um, story of the death of the son, but there was another facet to it that we were able to explore. And by the way, when I say I mean we, the writers.
Yes.
I have a very strong group of writers here, and as I've said over the years, some of the best writing I've ever done was done by someone else.
Yeah.
I'm only half joking because, you work in a writer's room, you have six heads. Six heads are always better than one. And then somebody puts their name on the script. And, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's somebody else, but everybody benefits from groupthink. And these guys are deep, and they're interested in the same kinds of things that I'm interested in exploring. And they're not all the same. I have some people who don't know anything about a mystery story or a cop story and don't care, but they're into the character. I have other people who really get into the engine, the plot engine, and want to drive the plot engine. So it's a little bit like my job is assembling, an orchestra, or a team.
Right.
And you want one quarterback, you don't want 12 quarterbacks.
Right. John, one last question, and I
Yes.
thank you for your time. Again, not to spoil things, but I felt at times in watching season 3 that I was almost watching a horror film, and
Yeah.
not just because of the presence of what's referred to as a monster, but because of Joe Leaphorn's psychological torment. How far did you want to go with that? Seems to me you went pretty far with that.
Yeah. Well, again, every season I'm trying to think of, what are we doing this year? Season 2, I wanted to lean into the noir aspect of the story. And so we coined this phrase Navajo noir, where we were
Ah,
telling a noir story, but from a Navajo perspective. And then in season 3, I was looking for something else. And one of the writers said, why don't we do Navajo horror? And it seemed to be right in the wheelhouse for AMC because they do that sort of thing very well. And so we started talking about how could we do that, and then we just leaned into it to tell this horror story. And I remember talking to Zahn. We were on set one day outside of his the Leaphorn house, and we were talking about this monster, and it dawned on me, and it didn't even really hit me until I was talking to him about it. He was trying to get in his mind how he was going to play this. It dawned on me that he is haunted by this thing, and it's a monster that is tearing him apart from the inside out. And he is so desperate to exorcise that monster that he does, and then it gets into the world.
Yeah.
And,
Mike, that's just wonderful. My guest on Writers at Work has been John Wirth, writer, producer, and showrunner, whose current project is The Wonderful Dark Winds on AMC. John, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Jim.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.